I miss the dry, lethargic heat of summer. Not that it's not been hot recently. I mean, this past year was a record heatwave across most of Europe, but it just doesn't feel like it used to. Maybe it's just because I'm older now and the days are busier and shorter. There's this certain long, dull tiredness that I just don't seem to feel nowadays when summer reaches its apex. Weirdly, I've always associated that feeling with church. My family weren't particularly religious, but every year they'd send me to a local Christian day club for the first week of summer. I suspect it was as much for the free daycare as it was for any spiritual reason. That's besides the point. I won't name the club, but if you care enough to find out, there aren't many large organisations of its kind in the UK, so if you look through local news it shouldn't be too hard to find. Myself and my 3 older brothers each in turn went to it in a small town in Buckinghamshire called Greater Midden. It was perfectly nestled among the chalk hills and beechwoods, a postcard-perfect remnant of that old English life that you only see in Constable paintings. Despite having since lost my faith, my memories of the holiday club and those warm summer days stick in my mind as some of the best and happiest of my childhood. Having said that, though, I have one memory that doesn't fit into that mould. The summer of July 2006. I was about 7 or 8, and I particularly remember the journeys to Greater Midden that year. It had been a long, roasting summer, the kind that bakes farms down to little more than tinder-brown scrub fields. We didn't live in Greater Midden. My parents had settled down in an even smaller, less affluent village, maybe halfway between there and Weybridge a decade before my birth. The 20-minute car journey between home and the club took us through the ancient beech woodlands and rolling hills of South Buckinghamshire. That week, the dense haze of summer stuck low to the ground. Streams that usually sparkled through the woods by the road were dried into muddy beds cracked like glazed porcelain, or long puddles of stagnant muck that buzzed beneath clouds of mosquitoes and midges. The peat-dark water was obscured by cloying algae that blanketed the surface. Tar in the road surface bubbled up beneath us. I remember the heat, my mum's arm hanging out of the driver's side window, the roaring AC and the wind from the cars rush through the forest failing to cool us. It could be worse, she said. She pointed out a low smear of dark on the horizon, just visible past the trunks of passing beeches and the odd pine. There was a gorse fire about 10 miles away, near Prince's Risborough, that a girl and her parents had been caught in. Only the daughter had survived. There had been concern over whether the holiday club would go ahead that year. The club usually consisted of perhaps 300 kids doing art, crafts, drama, cooking and other stuff, spread across a half-dozen marquees and tents in the town's large central park. Prayer bookended the day in the morning and evening with a sermon somewhere in the middle. Overall, it was a good, clean week of Christian fun. Without any real protection from the heatwave, though, anxious parents had worried about sticking their children outside for so long, and attendance took a little bit of a hit that year. These fears were mostly unfounded, though, and the whole operation went smoothly. The only major change to plans that the staff enacted was a cancellation of outdoor games, for obvious reasons. This was instead replaced with free time. On the surface, this sounded good. An extra 50 minutes for the kids to play together and make friends. It wasn't that simple, though. There was no space in any of the tents for the 80-odd kids who were assigned to free time per slot, so they instead had to cluster about the few trees that the kids were allowed to sit around. The club was held across the 5 days of the working week, with a family church service on the Sunday. By the Thursday, us kids were getting bored and whiny, and the group leaders, a couple of 15-year-olds tackled with controlling a dozen irritating children, were getting snappy in response. To make matters worse, our slots for free time were all in the afternoon, in the hottest part of the day. The park was bordered on one side by the town and the main road, while the other end of it disappeared into a thicket of woods, which us kids were absolutely forbidden from exploring. I remembered vaguely that there was a stream in these woods, though, and thought I'd wander off to take a look. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure why I did that nowadays. I was usually a fairly rule-abiding child, and I knew I'd get in trouble if I left the group, but something just pulled me into that shaded copse of beech and pine. The counsellors, distracted by their own gossip and drama, didn't notice me toddle away and duck under the red and white tape that bordered the grounds. No one watched me as I slipped into the cool, embracing shadows of those decades-old trees. I don't remember how far I walked. I suppose it could only have been 10-15 minutes, but it felt longer. Twigs and dry leaves rustled and snapped under my feet like the bones of small animals. Eventually, I reached the dry bed of a stream and knelt down to inspect it. There, among the leaf-littered soil that had drifted into the stream since it had dried up, was the papyrus-dried corpse of a stickleback, blind idiot eye gazing back up at me. Looking up myself, I saw a structure on the other side of the dead stream and walked towards it. I remember feeling an unlikely shiver creep slowly, menacingly up from the small of my back. It was a play park. I couldn't guess how long it had been since it saw attention from the council, years by the looks of things. A rusted carousel sat motionless, sustained by the pigeons that sat in the boughs above it. A miniature obstacle course, frayed ropes and metal bars, coated in flaked red and green paint, led to a plastic slide that had bleached to a sickly salmon over 4,000 sunny days. The place stank of urine and fox musk. There was a growing sense of unease gnawing its way out of my reptile brain, a part of me desperate to leave the place and flee back to the safety and boredom of free time. I couldn't, though. I've always been something of a curious kid, too curious, many a frustrated teacher would tell you. There was still one more thing that had to be seen. At the centre of the play park was a playhouse shaped like a rocket. Fiberglass and rusted metal, its outside carried a once carefully applied patchwork of blue, black and yellow squares. The perspex windows were fogged with age and layers of mossy grime. Inexplicable trepidation sent my heart into thudding spasms, like the slapping of a fish against the forest floor as it drowned in the air. I approached the craft and entered through a small hatch in the bottom. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, and when they did, I saw what, somehow, I'd really been expecting to find there. In this strange abandoned play park at the back end of a quiet woodland park in the heart of the country, there was, of course, nothing. A low bench ran around the circular interior, and on the floor were discarded beer bottles, cigarette butts, and even a couple of condoms. I, of course, didn't recognise them as such at the time. I was up to my ankles in leftovers from the rebellious middle-class youths of Greater Midden. A shaft of sun, caught on the thick dust and haze within the rocket, came in through the glazed window and left a golden coin of light on the opposite bench. Cobwebs and dirt masked the ceiling, and in the corner a fat black spider sat in its cotton wool web, waiting with glossy menace. The sense of unease ebbed. I'd been silly. I remember relief flooding me as I realised the mundanity of the situation. There were plenty of places like this, I told myself. 100 little areas that had fallen by the wayside, probably in the county alone. I'd allowed myself to get spooked, and even laughed at myself as I stepped back out of the playhouse and onto the welcoming soil of the forest floor. It was then that I heard a high, life-shattering wail. It was the banshee scream of a child. I stumbled through those woods for hours, seeing nothing but 1,000 reaching identical trees through the veil of tears that covered my eyes. In the distance, I heard more screams, then sirens, and then a stunned silence that seemed to smother my surroundings. Even the birds seemed, in my panic, too scared to make a noise. I was finally found by a member of staff around 8 p.m. who took me, still crying, to my mum, who sat in the club's HQ tent with a police officer and a cup of coffee. Her eyes were raw with crying. She enveloped me in a hug and scolded me for running off. It wasn't until we were safely in the car an hour later, wending our way back along those country lanes, through those forests that loomed and lengthened in the evening, that I asked my mum what had happened back in Greater Midden. She stopped the car and stared straight ahead, seeing nothing. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. I looked out the window at woodland stained blood-red with the setting sun as my mum told me the story, her voice cracking again with tears. A 6-year-old from the Christian club, crossing the street to go to the toilet in a nearby cafe, had been struck by a speeding SUV on the main road. He was dead by the time the ambulance had arrived.